morning, the reading is by Jonathan Haidt. This is from the book that we will be taking on as our second book on our Sunday afternoon discussion group starting in about 3 weeks. It's called Intuitions Come First from the Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Religion and Politics. Webster's Third International Dictionary defines delusion as a false conception and persistent belief unconquerable by reason in something that has no existence in fact. As an intuitionist, I would say that the worship of reason is itself an illustration of one of the most long-lived delusions in Western history, the rationalist delusion. Anyone who values truth should stop worshiping reason. We all need to take a cold, hard look at the evidence and see reasoning for what it is. The French cognitive scientists Hugo Messier and Dan Sperber recently reviewed the vast research literature on motivated reasoning in social psychology and on the biases and errors of reasoning in cognitive psychology. And they concluded that most of the bizarre and depressing research findings make perfect sense once you see reasoning as having evolved not to help us find the truth, but to help us engage in arguments, persuasion, and manipulation in the context of discussions with other people. As they put it, skilled arguers are not after the truth, but after arguments supporting their views. Now, I'm not saying we should stop all reasoning and go with our gut. Sometimes gut feelings are better at guides for reasoning than when we make consumer choices, for example, and in interpersonal judgments. But they're often disastrous as a basis for public policy, for science, and for law. Rather, what I'm saying is that we must be wary of any individual's ability to reason. We should not expect individuals to produce good, open-minded, truth-seeking reasoning, particularly when self-interest or reputational concerns are in play. But if you put individuals together in the right way, such that some individuals can use their reasoning powers to disconfirm the claims of others, and all individuals feel some common bond or shared fate that allows them to interact civilly, you can create a group that ends up producing good reasoning as an emergent property in the social system. And that's why it's so important to have intellectual and ideological diversity within any group or institution whose goal is to find the truth, like an intelligence agency or a community of scientists, or to produce good public policy, like a legislature or an advisory board. And if our goal is to produce good behavior, not just good thinking, then it's even more important to reject rationalism and embrace intuitionism. Nobody is ever going to invent an ethics class that makes people behave ethically after they step out of the classroom. A man is rescued from a desert island after 20 years all alone. Who's amazed at this feat of survival, ask him to show them around the home he's made for himself. How did you survive? How did you keep sane? They ask him as he shows them around his small island. I had faith. My faith as a Jew who kept me strong. Come. He leads them to a small glen where stands an opulent temple made entirely from palm fronds, coconut shells, and woven grass. The news cameras take in everything, even a Torah made from banana leaves and written in octopus ink. This took me 5 years to complete. Amazing. And what did you do for the next 15 years? Come with me. He leads them around to the far side of the island, and there in a shady grove is an even more beautiful temple. This one took me 12 years to complete. But sir, asked the reporter, why did you build 2 temples? This is the temple I attend. That other place? Ha! I wouldn't set foot in that other temple if you paid me. It's awfully easy to get into arguments, even sometimes with ourselves. And it's awfully hard to get strange and foolish are these walls of separation that divide us. These are times we especially need to remember the wisdom of Hosea Ballou, who said, if we agree in love, there is no disagreement that can do us any injury. But if we do not, no other agreement can do us any good. We find polarization all around us these days. Political conflicts between conservatives, liberals, libertarians, religious conflicts between fundamentalists and liberals or progressives, sports, patriots versus, well, you get the idea. Sometimes the most passion comes in those contests. In religion, we see polarities between a belief in original sin and original goodness, which is more our style. Salvation by grace and salvation by character, a belief in faith versus a belief in reason. Now, as Jonathan Haidt points out in our reading this morning, many of the arguments we offer each other in the midst of our sometimes shouted disagreements amount to rationalization to support conclusions we've come to in advance of the conversation. In his view, it's only by listening to those who have opposing commitments that we can arrive at some approximation of the truth, or at least some agreement about policy actions to take in the problems that we all share together. We often reason our way into boxes rather than out of them. That's one of the reasons I find conspiracy theories so fascinating. You know, of course, that the Bush administration was behind 9/11. And I assume that all thinking people are now aware that the CIA was behind the assassination of John F. Kennedy because he wanted to end the Cold War and they couldn't tolerate that. And everybody knows that Barack Obama was not born in the United States. No right being president of this country. And if you look carefully, you will notice that the Masons are on their way to taking over the U.S. government. Or was it the Jews? Unitarian Universalists? Conspiracy theories are self-sealing systems, and no amount of information will convince their adherents that they're wrong. They will additionally find new facts which will support their own paranoid point of view. That we readily fall into supporting my side in family arguments. One clue that we're engaged in rationalization is the emergence of words like "you always" or "you never." Like, for example, "you always criticize my driving," like once in the past month. "You never take out the garbage," like I missed twice in the last year. It's hard to observe our own rationalizations, a reality witnessed by the poet Robert Burns. Oh, would some power the gift give us to see ourselves as others see us. We start from what we know in our hearts to be true, and then we use our highly developed reasoning skills to construct the finest defenses we can imagine to justify what we already believe. The late novelist David Foster Wallace, in his graduation address at Kenyon College in 2005, said, "A huge percentage of the stuff that I tend to be automatically certain of is, it turns out, totally wrong and deluded." Here's one example of the utter wrongness of something I tend to be automatically sure of. Everything in my own immediate experience supports my deep belief that I am the absolute center of the universe, the realest, the most vivid and important person in existence. He goes on to say, other people's thoughts and feelings have to be communicated to you somehow, but your own are so immediate, urgent, real. You get the idea. But please don't worry, he says, that I'm going to preach to you about compassion or other directness or the so-called virtues. This is not a matter of virtue. It's a matter of my choosing to do the work of somehow altering or getting free of my natural, hardwired default setting, which is to be deeply and literally self-centered and to see and interpret everything through the lens of self. So we need to cultivate insight and humility. We need to learn to listen both to what we say and mean and to what others say and mean. We learn to see more clearly the strange and foolish walls that separate us. So how do we end up having such polarized beliefs about religion and politics anyway? Jonathan Haidt suggests that we can identify 6 pillars of moral reasoning, fundamental commitments that underlie all of our reasoning and argumentation. All of us share these foundational pillars as we make moral, political, and ethical decisions, but we place different emphases on one or another depending on our temperament, our culture, and how we were socialized, as well, of course, as our life experiences. Sometimes these commitments seem to shift on generational lines. So, do any of you parents who consider yourself liberals have children who are conservative, or maybe sons or daughters-in-law? How about the other way? You're a little conservative and your kids are a little more grandkids too. I'm an example of that. My family is very conservative, both religiously and politically, and I'm, well, pretty much the opposite. Same thing has happened kind of on a cultural level between the greatest generation and the 60s generation, between the 60s and Gen X, Gen Y, known as the millennials. And each generation, the adults say, kids these days. So let's illustrate with an example from political discourse. Liberals are especially concerned with protecting those who are vulnerable to harm. We could say that one of the highest values for religious and political liberals is care for victims of oppression. So liberals tend to see reductions in food stamps as an attack on the poor and hungry in our nation. And when talking about climate change, are especially concerned about the poorest of the poor in the world, who will suffer the most as a result of those changes in our weather and climate. Liberals are also passionately committed to personal liberty. So many of our moral decisions are based on the idea that if what I do doesn't hurt anyone, it's something we ought to be perfectly free to do. And finally, liberals care especially about fairness, especially fairness of opportunity. Everyone should be able to start at the same starting point. So liberals are strongly influenced by these 3 pillars: care, harm, personal liberty, and fairness of opportunity. Libertarians tend to highlight primarily personal freedom above all other moral pillars, and they argue that everything would be just fine if we were all able to do whatever we pleased, and the invisible hand would make everything fine. And finally, conservatives have a wider and more varied range of commitments. They're also concerned about the vulnerable, about liberty for the individual, and about fairness of outcomes. But they also put emphasis on loyalty to those close to them, to their nation or their community. So patriotism has a very high value. And military service is often more highly regarded by conservatives than liberals. American exceptionalism gets a good audience here. We are the greatest nation on earth, for example. They place emphasis on respect for authority, respect for law and order, respect for those who serve their country. And they place an especially high value on things that are sacred. Some things, actions, and people are pure, noble, and elevated, while others are base, polluted, and degraded. So we could say that for conservatives, the most sacred value is the preservation of institutions and traditions that sustain moral community, which trumps the unfettered choices of the individual. What strange and foolish walls. Of course, I don't think they're foolish. I'm right. They're wrong. We'll go into more detail when we read the book. We get some wonderful debates about political choices that are based on one or several of these moral pillars. Great debates that claim on one side that most of our problems as a society can be traced to moral decay. And on the other side, that problems arise from the fact that not everyone has fair chances, that morality is derived from circumstances rather than itself being a foundational value. Now that's pretty complicated as an explanation of our polarization, but it has the strength of enabling us to see that we approach morality and belief based on radically different intuitions that aren't subject to change as a result of argumentation. So that's how we get into fights some of the time. I wanted to talk in particular this morning about climate change as an example of how we get into conflicts that don't seem to have any resolution. And I would point out that one of our core strengths as a religious community is that we welcome and celebrate a diversity of beliefs. And that commitment calls for us not to just tolerate other points of view, but to listen carefully to others and to recognize that none of us, not me, not you, not anyone, none of us know the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So in the issue of climate change, Jonathan Haidt wrote an article he called How to Talk to a Conservative About Climate Change. And I should say that Haidt himself identifies as a liberal, but he was puzzled by why we seem to get into these intransigent fights over things that are perfectly clear to some of us on both sides. In the article, he makes a few points of which I want to highlight three. He notes that, quote, our climate change debate is stuck into a left-wing ghetto. This was one of the provocative conclusions reached recently by a high level of politicians, environmental thinkers, journalists, and business people in London. They, by the way, were concerned about the fact that under a conservative government, some of the challenges that the previous government in Great Britain had taken up were being abandoned. In their report, they say, 20 years of awareness-raising, grandiose pleas to save the planet, lots of talk about sacrifice, apocalyptic messages, and photos of polar bears have trapped climate change in a niche that it urgently needs to break out of. So three of the issues that Haidt points out is conservatives react against presentations about climate change that seem to use scientific evidence as a way to presuppose that particular policies should be adopted. So if the solution to climate change is a growth in the size of government, especially horrors of international governmental action, then all of the scientific evidence that supports the idea that we are undergoing climate change will be rejected because adopting the policy recommendations would undermine their own deeply held commitments to economic freedom and loyalty to our nation and our locality. So here's a comment in response to his article by one Robert Horn. This is back in August of 2012. He says, the editorial misses the major problem caused by the tight intermingling of policy discussions with science. It's very hard to explain that you agree with the science while completely disagreeing with the recommended policies. The attitude towards science will suffer when science is viewed as taking sides on policy rather than just clarifying the situation and risk. Interestingly, a number of conservative economists have recently taken up the cause of a carbon tax because they see this as the least intrusive way of beginning to take action against climate change. A strong argument here is that it's just unfair for industry to release pollution into the atmosphere without covering the full costs of their actions. So that fairness code, people ought to get what they deserve as a result of doing the right thing. A second issue is that green advocacy can sometimes take on the trappings of a religion by itself. Here are a couple of other comments in response to Haidt's article. This by Nicholas Beale. He says, a major reason for this polarization is the aggressive anti-religious bias of some prominent scientific commentators. They claim quite falsely that science requires people to abandon their faith, and as a result, they spread massive public distrust of science. Here's another, Conrad Baylor. He says, there's no climate change crisis. That's precisely why we have a standoff. Zealots have created a religion and established the Church of Climate Change. Normal, rational people aren't going to join. It's as simple as that. Liberals and conservatives respect different sources of authority. Liberals tend to favor scientific investigation, while conservatives have a higher regard for traditional sources of authority. So any conversation about climate change has to take these differences into account without requiring the abandonment of deeply held beliefs on either side. Otherwise, it becomes sterile and futile. It's significant that the National Association of Evangelicals, representing most of the conservative churches in America, and not without opposition within their own ranks, has taken a strong stand on climate change and the need to take action to mitigate it, based for them on the biblical imperative to serve as stewards of our earth. Not so different from our own seventh principle, commitment to respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And then finally, it's important to notice that many of us are better able to relate to things that affect us most directly. Sometimes arguments about climate change are pressed in global terms and in the language of science. For most people, especially conservatives, these conversations are better placed in local terms. So, for example, there's now pretty widespread agreement that the level of the oceans is gradually rising. And as a result, it's now more possible for liberals and conservatives to come together and find common cause in working to mitigate those effects on their local communities. Importantly, spokespeople who are from outside of the scientific community are often the most effective advocates. Business people are beginning to take notice that the insurance industry is already pricing the expected effects of climate change into their insurance policy. That's a direct local economic argument against not taking any action. The military has begun to consider the effects of climate change on future international conflicts and other factors that will change the nature of warfare in the future. So persuading opinion leaders with local issues is one effective way of communicating concerns about climate change. We all live our lives in the midst of contradictions. When polarization is most intense, it's useful to identify the polarized positions and say that both are true, rather than to pick sides. F. Scott Fitzgerald put it this way. He said, the test of a first-grade intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. One should, for example, be able to see that things are hopeless and yet be determined to make them otherwise. It's automatic for us, as David Foster Wallace put it, to see the world only through our own eyes, to lose sight of the fact that our own perspectives and commitments can only be particular to us, to fail to listen from the heart while we stop our brains from constructing counter-arguments to whatever idiotic beliefs somebody else expresses to us. To overcome these kinds of deep-seated conflicts, I have to choose to do the work. I have to acknowledge my own deep self-centeredness. I have to become a little more humble about what I know with absolute certainty. I have to learn to recognize my part in building those strange and foolish walls of separation that divide us. And sometimes we just have to drown our differences in love. Here's a poem by Carl Dennis, Dancers. At least one couple tonight at the Topaz Room may have quarreled on the long drive over in the rain about whether moving to a drier climate and making new friends would brighten their outlook. Still they agree, for this evening at least, that dancing is something they're willing to try. Maybe tonight, for once, they'll be able to feel what they'd like to feel. That moving to music is an instance, not merely a metaphor, of life lived as it should be lived. Other dancers may be more graceful, but among the clumsy, these two may have learned to look at their feet without embarrassment. And if they can't set aside all their differences, maybe they can agree tonight that consensus is the wrong model for them, too close for comfort in their private commonwealth, to one-party rule, to tyranny. A dance they enjoy. And it won't prove that division is far behind them, just that they're making their peace with it. As one defers or the other decides, the tune has come from afar to find them here where they ought to be, in the Topaz Room, taking one step forward, one step back.